Welcome to a presentation on basics on the formation of the Pentateuch. In this presentation, I'll be focusing on primary points of disagreement. My name is David Carr, and I teach at Union Theological Seminary. And I want to start by giving some cautions because I've taught this material for many years, and I often experience that students have some issues as they encounter it. And the primary point of this presentation is in a pretty short compass to help you visualize some major differences between different approaches to the formation of the Pentateuch, especially its earliest stages. But I want to mention that as you work through this material, there's a lot of technical details because I want to give you specific reasons that scholars have for preferring this or that model. And at points, you may need to just pause the presentation and take in the comments and that sort of thing before you move forward. And you may come away with the impression that scholars just can't agree about anything, and you just throw up your hands and figure it's hopeless. And I would just want to stress that actually scholars have achieved an amazing level of consensus on some major points, even though I'll be summarizing points where we disagree. And I've covered these points of agreement in a separate briefer presentation, which is part 1 on basics on the formation of the Pentateuch. And I would encourage you to view that if you have not already, to set this presentation in context. And I'll just mention, as I do at the end of that presentation, that the main point of scholarly disagreement about the formation of the Pentateuch relates to what may be its earliest stages of formation, and that has to do with the dating and formation of non-priestly material found in the books of Exodus, Genesis, and Numbers. Each of these books also contains some priestly material that scholars agree can be assigned to a priestly source. But the non-priestly material found in those books is the point where we disagree amongst ourselves. And I'll try to summarize some of those disagreements here. So the aims of this presentation are to initially outline the scholarly disagreement between 2 basic models for the formation of these non-priestly materials found in the Pentateuch. To illustrate how these 2 models would interpret information found primarily in the Abraham story differently. And I start with the Abraham story because this is the first major block of the Pentateuch where these scholarly disagreements come to the fore. These 2 different models have relatively similar pictures of the formation of primeval history in Genesis 1 to 11. But then I want to talk also about why these questions matter, how it's not just a scholarly debate about this or that date or that sort of thing, but they actually can make a difference in how we interpret some important texts. And again, I'll focus on the Abraham story. And I'll conclude with a brief coda, 1 slide, where I summarize some additional debates that scholars in each of these 2 camps have amongst themselves about terminology and method and that kind of thing, just so you have a more specific idea of some of these broader issues and can set the broader presentation that I give here in context. That said, I'll mention that a lot of this latter stuff in this brief coda is pretty specific, and it has to do with the fact that I'm a specialist in this area and I can hardly help myself in terms of adding some qualifications to what I say here in the presentation. But if you're already a little bit overwhelmed with material, just feel free to leave that final slide aside. So I want to start with that visualization process, this time focusing on how the documentary hypothesis or source of hypothesis would envision the earliest formation of these non-priestly Pentateuchal materials. And it would start with a early 10th or 9th century BCE J or Yahwistic document written in Judah, the southern kingdom that had its capital in Jerusalem. This J document would have included a primeval history with a Garden of Eden story and Cain and Abel and a flood story, and continued into the Abraham story, and then also included parts of what is now the Jacob story and Joseph stories before moving to Moses and the Israelites. This E document would cross all those, the J document would cross all those blocks. And it would then be paralleled a century or 2 later by an Eloistic document written in the north, possibly in the capital Samaria in the 9th or 8th century BCE. And this E document probably didn't have or doesn't seem to have had a primeval history covering flood and creation, but it certainly would have included, according to the documentarians, some sections on Abraham and on Jacob and Isaac and Joseph and Moses and the Israelites as well, and paralleled thus the material in the J document that had been written a century or two earlier in the South. And these two sources then would represent the earliest blocks of our Pentateuch. Later on, according to some forms of the documentary approach, they would have been combined with each other into what some scholars would refer to as a Yehuvistic document, or JE. I put these terms in question marks because an important recent form of the documentary hypothesis, the neo-documentarian approach, does not agree that this Yehuvistic document ever existed as such. Instead, neo-documentarians would posit that the J and E documents were separate from each other, along with the later P document, and then the book of Deuteronomy, which is D, and that all four elements, J, E, D, and P, were combined at one time. Overall, then, I would urge us to think about the formation of the Pentateuch along the lines of this image of braiding, where you have parallel strands, J and E in this case, which are interwoven with each other into a new whole. Now, let's look at how the documentary approach would interpret data within the Pentateuch, especially the Abraham story, along these lines. As we look at the Abraham story, it would assign much of the non-priestly material in chapters 12 through 19, and also 26, which focuses on Isaac, to this early J source, and then assign much of the material about Abraham found in chapters 20 to 22 to an E source, and would see both of these sources that's then continuing into the stories that follow about Jacob, Joseph, and the Moses, Israel section. And this, for the documentarians, would help explain why we see such similar stories in these two blocks. For example, both the so-called E materials in Genesis 20 to 22 and the J materials in 12 to 19 include a story of Abraham endangering his wife Sarah by passing her off as a sister, or stories of the expulsion of Hagar from Abraham's family, which both feature her son Ishmael, or well disputes and a covenant with the Philistine monarch Abimelech. In this case, Isaac is the one who has these disputes and covenant in chapter 26 of J, or Abraham in chapter 21 of E. But they're otherwise extremely similar stories, which has led many scholars to think that they might belong to different sources. And this would be among the many forms of data that scholars would use to reconstruct originally separate J and E sources in these chapters of Genesis. Now, scholars like myself have raised various issues about the documentary approach, and I'll try to briefly summarize them here. Initially, I would point to the fact that there is a striking lack of links between various subparts of the Pentateuch, especially the primeval history and the non-priestly materials about Jacob, Joseph, and Moses and the Israelites, such that each of these units in many ways seems to stand on its own. And then when we do actually look at promise texts and other things that do link these different parts with each other, at least in these sections, they often look to be secondary additions to blocks that originally really were self-contained. In addition, the assumptions of the documentarian approach, at least in its classical form, that there were early extended pre-exilic sources crossing all the different parts of the Pentateuch, clashes with the fact that our datable pre-exilic texts, like prophets like Hosea, for example, lack mention of distinctive Pentateuchal themes that actually link these subparts with each other. Like they lack mention of the promise, and many of them lack much of a focus on Abraham. And when we take a closer look at these non-Pentateuchal texts that talk about Pentateuchal themes, books like Hosea originate in the north, not the south, whereas the early material assigned to prophets like Isaiah or Micah doesn't tend to mention Pentateuchal themes. And when we take a closer look at the non-priestly materials about Jacob, they tend to feature northern place names like Bethel or Penuel, which is another potential pointer that the earliest origins of important parts of the Pentateuch don't lie in a Judean southern J source, but instead in some kind of northern compositions. Finally, the theory that there were long J and E documents lying behind these non-priestly materials that covered similar stories about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses has led some people pursuing the documentary approach to really try to slice and dice the non-priestly texts excessively so that they could reconstruct a complete and corresponding form of J and E sources. They'd create problems in texts and rather than solving them. And so that's also led to a relative lack of consensus amongst scholars in many respects about what can be assigned to these J and E sources. A lack of consensus that actually contrasts with the remarkable consensus that scholars have achieved about the contents of a priestly source. And this also has raised questions for many people about the reliability of this part of the documentary approach, even though many scholars agree on the existence of a priestly source. So let's now talk about another model for the early formation of the Pentateuch, and it's one that I'll be terming the sources and supplements model. This model posits the earliest origins of the Pentateuch, not in long, early pre-exilic Pentateuchal sources, J and E, but instead in separate, more compact, earlier compositions that focused on subparts of what is now the Pentateuchal story. And according to this theory, for example, probably the earliest of these compositions would have been in the north, such as a northern Jacob story that is referred to by Hosea in some form, possibly an early Joseph story, although some people pursuing this approach would place the non-P Joseph story much later. Some sort of early non-priestly Moses story that again is known by the prophet Hosea and some other early pre-exilic figures and stands behind our present non-priestly materials in Exodus and Numbers. And then also some sort of pre-exilic non-priestly primeval narrative that stands behind the non-P materials of Genesis 1 to 11. And then various other traditions, whether in oral or written form, about Abraham, like a Lot Abraham story cycle, or the stories about Abraham found in chapters 20 to 22, or some sort of Hagar story in chapter 16 of Genesis, and an Abraham Sarah story that's plopped in chapter 12, that these are all different kinds of traditions that, as we see in the book of Genesis, have been combined with each other. But they're not remnants of just two sources. It's 4 or more different traditions in written or oral form. And then to sort of visualize how these materials were put together into our present Pentateuch, I use this diagram. It starts with these sort of early traditions and or written sources that focus on different subparts of the Pentateuch. And then they are linked with each other by multiple later linking layers. And that's why I use the term L, just to sort of put all those things together. And we don't know exactly how many of these there were, and sometimes we're not sure exactly how far they extended. But the thing that people pursuing the sources and supplements approach generally agree on is that these layers were later and were formed amidst periods of Judean and Israelite oppression under the Babylonians, when the Judeans were sent into exile in Babylon, or possibly under the Assyrians before the Babylonians. And so that's why there's this image of the burning of Jerusalem, which actually is the picture of Jerusalem burning at a later period, but I think it vividly images the sort of traumatic context in which many scholars pursuing the sources and supplements approach think these different earlier compositions were gathered together by these linking texts, many of them which really focus on promises of protection, of blessing, and of land which scholars pursuing this approach think were addressed to people who had lost their land, who felt vulnerable to imperial powers and needed those words of promise. And so these elements were added to their earlier traditions. The image that I urge you to have for sort of putting together how one might see this process comes from this quilt from Annie Mae Young, work clothes quilt with center medallion of strips, where you see earlier materials, textiles in this case, that have been joined end to end into a new powerful artistic whole. And so this is sort of the counterpart in the sources and supplements approach to that braiding image that I used for the documentarian one. So let's look again at what this approach involves. It later lay layers that link earlier components of the Pentateuch. An example of one of those linking texts would be the promise to Abraham that starts in Genesis 12, where it says something like, I'll make you a great nation, I'll bless you and make your name great, be a blessing, and I'll bless those who bless you and curse anyone who treats you lightly, and all the clans of the ground will bless themselves by you. This sort of promise is seen as a crucial linking text, in this case, linking the primeval history with the Abraham and other ancestral materials. And it's part of a reframing of earlier Abraham traditions that were outlined in the earlier slide, in light of this initial promise, so that those earlier traditions are now thoroughly saturated with the theme of this promise in diverse ways. And then as we proceed through the Jacob, Joseph, and Moses stories, we see the addition of this Abrahamic linking promise to them as well. And in those texts, it's more clearly a secondary addition to those materials. Let me give you an example of that. It comes in the story of Jacob's dream at Bethel. And I won't read all this to you. If you want to, you can pause the slide and review the contents of this, but it includes Jacob arriving at a certain place and going to sleep and dreaming of a ladder, which angels are going up and down on, and then God appears and gives him a whole series of promises, some of which are basically a repetition of the promise to Abraham, now to Jacob, and then some of which are quite relevant to what Jacob's specifically dealing with, which is he's fleeing his brother's murderous wrath, going to a foreign place. And Genesis 28:15 is God's promise of protection as he's on that trip. Now, scholars aren't sure exactly how much of this material was added. I myself have changed opinions over the years, but at least the material that's outlined in red is virtually a repetition of key parts of God's promises to Abraham in chapters 12, and especially chapter 13 of the non-P Abraham story. And one model for how this story was formed is that it started with a basic dream epiphany that Jacob had, where he got a promise from God of protection along the way. And then that was enhanced by later authors working in this context of later imperial oppression that added these notes of Abrahamic promise of land and progeny to an earlier story that was more focused really on issues specific. Now, I wouldn't be straightforward if I didn't mention that scholars have raised a number of important points about this sort of approach to the non-P materials of the Pentateuch, the sources and supplements approach here. And so even though I'm an advocate of that approach, let me do my best to summarize some of these issues here. To start, some such studies in this sources and supplements approach have tended to assume that a self-contained episode of a narrative, such as the Jacob story that we just looked at, had to have been independent until proven connected to another text by way of a back reference or anticipation or so on. So the idea is that you have a Jacob story, Joseph novella, and Moses story, and it had to include all sorts of cross-references, forward and backward and so on, as if every author is always worried about making connections between different episodes in their story as they write them, rather than just telling a story about Jacob, and then telling a story about Joseph and a story about Moses, And then maybe, yeah, there's a reference here or there, but that's not essential to the story, and an author doesn't have to constantly do that. So anyway, that's one question about the mode of our argumentation that people in the sources and supplement approach have had it. In addition, much as I mentioned earlier, that the scholars within a documentarian approach have sometimes not been able to achieve the same level of consensus about what is in J and E. It's also proven difficult for scholars working in the sources and supplements approach to agree on exactly where various later layers are located and when they're dated. And so that would raise certain questions for scholars about how plausible this model might be for the formation of these non-P materials. So let me now summarize the bigger picture in terms of ongoing differences between these two approaches, again, focusing on the Abraham story. In the documentary approach, or other people would term just the pure source critical approach to the non-P text, they're just sources, two sources. And the non-P Abraham story is largely a linkage of two longer pre-exilic sources, J, found in most of Genesis 12 to 19, and E, found in 20 to 22, with both of these sources continuing into the rest of the Pentateuch. In the sources and supplements approach, the non-P Abraham story was produced through a combination of multiple Abraham traditions, whether written or very likely oral, because these traditions were so thoroughly saturated with that later linking promise theme, and revised in light of that theme. And then that linking promise blessing theme was added secondarily to other non-P blocks like the Jacob and Joseph stories or the Moses story. And the non-P blocks of the Pentateuch, according to the sources and supplements approach, started out as separate texts before they were linked together end to end by these linking promise texts. And this overall difference in approaches really leads to some different interpretations of texts in the Pentateuch. Again, let's focus on the Abraham story. The documentary hypothesis, positing early J and E sources, sees them as created in and serving to reinforce early Judean and Israelite kingdoms, who are pictured here through this artistic rendering of David's Jerusalem, even though some documentarians now wouldn't date any of these sources that far back. So within this sort of form of the documentary hypothesis, a text like that promise to Abraham in Genesis 12, 2-3 of protection, nationhood, and blessing would be, say, a J source, reinforcement of the Davidic kingdom in Jerusalem, or at least some other kingdom in early Israel. Within the sources and supplements approach, you still have sources, they're just sort of more discrete, focused compositions. You have these older compositions, but they were joined and reshaped by later linking layers formed in a dramatic context of imperial oppression under Assyria or Babylonia. So that a text like God's promises to Abraham in Genesis 12, 2-3 of protection, blessing, and nationhood are promises really addressed to people who are feeling vulnerable and victimized by these imperial aggressors in Assyria or Babylon. And so those promises are interpreted in that light. Now, as we take a look at these two models, whether the sources and supplements sort of quilting approach or the pure sources braiding approach, of course, we shouldn't let our choice of which model makes sense be based on which sort of interpretation we like better, whether it was addressed to traumatized Judeans or addressed to reinforce an early Judean kingdom. And that's why I've summarized so many of the different arguments that are used for these different approaches. And there are many more, but hopefully this has given you a taste of some of the differences that stand between these scholars. In my experience, students often find the documentarian approach with just two sources to be a little more palatable and understandable. You've got, J and E, and then the later D and P, and they all get put together. And so that's certainly an advantage from a pedagogical point of view. I myself find the sources and supplements approach more helpful in explaining the data that's found in the non-priestly materials, even as I still find a source approach to P and D to be compelling. And so that's why I talk of a sources and supplements approach. Now, as I promised, there are actually further debates that scholars have in each of these two approaches. Within the documentary approach, I've already mentioned there's been the emergence of a neo-documentarian version of that approach, which attempts to reconstruct more complete versions of the J and E sources that then, along with P and D, were combined at one time to create our present Pentateuch. And there's an explicit emphasis in this neo-documentarian approach on leaving questions of dating of these sources to the side while reconstructing them. That this linkage to history from a neo-documentarian approach has been a problematic aspect of past source critical approaches. And then more classical source critical approaches, which still work with some sort of dating, often pre-exilic dating of J and E, as well as believing there was a JE Yehuvistic document before it was later combined with D and P. And among the sources and supplements scholars, there's certainly disagreement, starting with the fact that most other scholars within this approach wouldn't even use that term of sources and supplements for their approach. They might use the term a traditio-historical or redaction historical approach to designate what they are up to, as opposed to sources and supplements. And although most scholars working within this approach would use the term non-P or non-priestly to describe the materials that they're explaining, they wouldn't necessarily use this term L to characterize the later layers that link these earlier blocks of material. Much as I find that term helpful, it remains to be seen how much that carries the day among my colleagues. And also I should mention there are some important questions that have been raised about how much various non-priestly texts in the sources and supplements approach actually are very late and post-date the priestly source. And that leads to a whole bunch of questions about linguistic dating that go beyond the scope of this presentation. So by now you may be feeling a bit confused, and hopefully it'll be helpful for you to go back and review some parts of this presentation to help visualize the differences between these approaches. Insofar as it's helpful, I'll mention here's the pure advertisement. These second editions of the textbooks that I wrote and co-wrote, the Intro to the Hebrew Bible, Contemporary Introduction to the Christian Old Testament and Jewish Tanakh, which is the second edition of my textbook, where in chapter 10, I go into more detail on these issues. And it was just published in the spring of 2021, as well as chapter 6 of the Contemporary Introduction to the Bible, which I co-authored with Colleen Conway, who wrote the New Testament sections of this book, and also includes an abbreviated version of this discussion. Both of these are available through the Wiley website or Amazon or whatever source you use for your books. And for instructors, you can also order an evaluation copy via the Wiley website. Anyway, I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing how this helps various people work with this important set of topics.